It was a big week for our next guest, scoring the first interview with billionaire Dan Gilbert since his stroke last May. Now, Chad Livengood has had some time to reflect on the interview and investigate how Dan Gilbert's medical crisis could or should impact Metro Detroiters. Thanks for being back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we talked about the interview. It was a lot. It was, it was very interesting to see what Dan Gilbert has gone through and his fight back.
Yeah, and so Dan talked a lot about his experience with the healthcare industry. One that regular health insurance doesn't cover all stroke rehab, and stroke is basically just a brain injury. It causes an injury to the brain. Dan Gilbert had a stroke on the right side of his brain, and it caused damage to the functions of his left side of his body. So he still can't use his arm. So when he came Friday to MGM Grand Casino and stood in front of the Cranes readership and gave a speech, he was standing, but his left arm is clearly not functional, and he has a long way to go to rehab. And so in this subject, this is kind of real personal to me. I had a brother who had a brain injury almost 16 years ago from an electrocution accident, a real freak thing that happened when he was 20 years old. And immediately, basically, his family insurance basically said, after a couple of weeks in the hospital, you're going to a nursing home, and that's kind of where you're going to be for the rest of your life. And that's the reality for people who have brain injuries in Michigan, is that there's only so much that insurance covers for rehabilitating that body and that mind. Dan Gilbert found that out. Of course, Dan Gilbert can fill those cracks on his own with all the money he has. He can buy all the amount. Any amount of rehab, but normal people can't.
If he didn't have the money, he had the stroke but didn't have the money, he too would have found out that his insurance capped.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also the irony in this story is days before Dan Gilbert has this stroke, he led a successful overhaul of the no-fault auto insurance law in the legislature, where we had, for the longest time, for 45 years, we've had limitless medical benefits. If you're in a car accident, you get the best care possible. And that was one of the lessons from my own family learned with my brother's brain injury, was if he had been in a car, he would immediately go to a top-notch brain injury rehab center. There's several of them in Detroit, Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, the suburbs of Detroit, and those facilities have developed big programs that are centered around the auto insurance law, which provides this unlimited medical benefit. That's just unheard of elsewhere in healthcare. And Dan Gilbert led the fight to get rid of the unlimited medical benefit, or let people opt out of it and buy lower levels of insurance. Now, starting July 1st, people will still be able to buy that unlimited medical plan, but it won't be there won't be as many people in that same pool getting that catastrophic coverage.
Yeah, because the reality is if you're offered insurance for $500 a month or $200 a month or $100 a month, people are going to be looking at the bills and say, oh, I'll take the $200 or the $100. They're not going to realize that if they're in an accident, they're not going to get all that help that they could have.
Yeah, and that's going to be a big consumer education and big consumer choice to make when this new law goes into effect. That yes, it's promising big savings, but there are going to be big trade-offs. And even if your health insurance from your private employer or Medicare covers auto injuries, it's not going to cover the same type of care that you would get under the Michigan personal injury protection auto insurance coverage.
So people are looking at Dan Gilbert and they're saying, wow, look at him standing up there Friday. This is great to see. But behind all of that is the best care that money can buy.
Yeah.
And it's not really the kind of care that everybody would get. Did he or does he have any plans to try and improve care here in Michigan, or improve care for everybody, or educate people on these issues, or what are you finding out based on what you've heard so far?
So from talking to him and some of his associates, they are actively exploring what they can do to bring a better stroke rehab. And I think that this is still very initial thoughts. I don't think they have a firm, total global idea yet that's totally baked. But I wrote this piece for Cranes this week, kind of introducing the idea that this isn't just strokes, this is all brain injuries. Because the Brain Injury Association of Michigan, that represents all these different clinics, 8 out of 10 of the phone calls they get on a weekly basis come from people who got brain injuries, some way other than a vehicle. So those are people with stroke. Those are people who get into random electrocution accidents, horrific things like that. Or there's people who just slip and fall on a sidewalk and they bump their head and have a closed head injury. Or it's PTSD from some kind of traumatic event, whether it's violence or if they're a military member and they've served in a combat zone. So we have different types of brain injuries, and I think that's something that the Gilbert people are exploring. This is obviously not his forte. He's a mortgage mogul and a guy who owns a lot of real estate and a professional basketball team. And this is not healthcare is not an area he has a lot of experience in it, other than being personally going through this system. But he does seem to be genuinely interested in looking at how we can improve long-term rehab care for people who suffer these type of injuries like he did to his brain.
And tell us what Stephen Ross's role is now going to be.
Yeah, so Stephen Ross is this developer from New York, actually a native of Detroit. He's a nephew of the late Max Fisher, businessman in Detroit, an iconic businessman from the 20th century. And Stephen Ross is now a big-time billionaire developer, and he is going to commit $100 million towards the building of a University of Michigan campus downtown on that old Wayne County jail site that Dan Gilbert got in the jail swap deal. And Dan Gilbert is donating the land. That was one of the big announcements made Friday at our Cranes Newsmakers event.
Well, thank you for opening up the conversation, and I hope that people do discuss it, because it shouldn't matter whether you're in a car accident or have a stroke or fall. Anyone with a brain injury should have access to care, and I just think by having Dan Gilbert go through a stroke, it allows everybody to have a conversation, and hopefully we can find some solutions that are helpful to everyone.
Hopefully so.
Thanks for being brave enough to talk about it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll be right back with more News Now after this. He is a former congressman from the 11th District who went to Washington to see firsthand how government works. He also served in the military in both the Vietnam War and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now he's running again for the 11th District against Democratic incumbent Haley Stevens. Kerry Bentivolio, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks. I really appreciate being here. Thank you very much.
So why in the world, if you already went to Congress and got out, why would you want to go back?
Well, I was very effective. We won 2 constituent awards for serving our constituents, both Democrats, Republicans, Independents. And I was the first member of Congress, a freshman member of Congress in the last 50 years that passed 3 bills that actually protected our rights, not take them away.
You do have a TV and a radio and a newspaper. You're aware of what's going on in Congress now? There's a lot of bickering and fighting going on.
I understand. And, before I went to Washington, I was a school teacher. I was a high school teacher. I was licensed in vocational and general ed. And for the last 4 years, they gave me 2 classes a year out of the 5 classes we taught each day that were special ed for emotionally impaired children. And I think Washington is full of emotionally impaired members of Congress. And so I know how to control that kind of classroom. I did the same thing in Washington. I hate to insult those wonderful kids that I had, but,
but the comparison is there.
Yeah, the comparison is there.
What do you think is most important to get done that isn't getting done?
We have to protect our borders. We have a major problem with opioid addiction in this country. We have human trafficking taking place. And I've not only been to Central America as a congressman and toured the border. I know some of the problems. I understand. I'm a big fan of listening to our Border Patrol and our former INS, Immigration Nationalization, and what's going on with immigration. One of my big concerns was when people asked me about immigration, I replied that the problem with immigration is Democrats want the votes and Republicans want the cheap labor. Nothing will get done. And this has been going on for about 10 years.
Congresswoman Stevens is in office. She's
Yes.
active. She's raised money. It's tough to beat an incumbent. How do you go about pulling that off?
Well, it takes unity of effort on the Republican Party, and we all have to get together and hit the ground running. We have to put boots on the ground, going door to door and explaining our conservative Republican message and what it's all about, and follow through on doing the things that we intend to do. And I never made a promise that I couldn't keep. Right, I'm very proud of my record. I have a 93% conservative rating, 100% score for cutting government waste, second most transparent member of Congress, and we're always listening. We did a very good job doing that. I think that's what we have to do. We have to bring unity, and people have to come together instead of this. I don't know what you want to call it. It seems to be a lot more hate than there used to be. And I think we need to go in another direction.
You served in the military, as I mentioned, and thank you
Yes,
for
sir.
your service.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. How is the president doing in keeping his promise of honoring the veterans?
Well, he's cleaned up. I'm hearing a lot of good, positive feedback for what he's done to the Veterans Administration. A lot of people, I think he's put veterans or our military first, because that's our primary duty as a government, is protect our borders and protect our country. I think he's doing a really good job.
And that's an area you would offer more support.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I've been there and done that. You know, I like to tease. When I was NCO, my job was to make lieutenants into colonels.
And you're here to tell us about an event that's coming up this Friday.
Yes.
What is this event and why is it so important to you?
Well, there are about 30, there's a group called the Combat Veterans for Congress, and they support veterans who are combat veterans who served in the combat zone to run for public office. So we have an event this Friday, February 28th, and you and your listeners and viewers are welcome to attend. We call it an evening with Sarah Huckabee Sanders and friends, Charlie Kirk, Jan Morgan, and our MC is Rick Amato, and we have veterans coming that are endorsed that want to serve a second time, but this time in Congress or the Senate. We have a veteran female who lost her leg in an IED incident. I forget whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq, and we are getting behind her as well as other combat veterans. Here in Michigan, we have 5 combat veterans running for office. We're getting behind all of them and doing everything we can to raise money to put them back in service.
And tell us a little bit about Sarah Huckabee Sanders and the job she's done. It's been interesting.
Yes, it has. What I like best was, well, I like to tell people there's 5 things you'll have a hard time finding in Washington. Number 1 is truth. Number 2 is common sense. Number 3 is sense of humor. Number 4 is an honest reporter. And number 5, of course, is a parking space, right? So Sarah, as the press secretary for the president, she stood up to these, the press people and told them, you know, maybe you should take another look at this and stop being your bias, leaning in one direction, propagandist, and be a real investigative journalist and get out and find the facts, the pro and con. And that's what people need. They really want the truth, don't they?
Yeah.
And
sure.
people, if they know the truth and both sides of the issue, they can decide for yourself. Critical thinking, I think, in this country is well, it's the highest form of intelligence, but a lot of people, they don't really use their critical thinking skills. And I think it's important that, like when I was a teacher, do your homework, right? We need to do our homework and push aside this fog, if you will, of hyperbole, bias, half-truths, whatever you want to call it. I think it's important for us because together, if we do that and we look for the truth and we find it, we can make an intelligent decision.
And how are evenings like this effective? Do they bring the party together, or do they just raise money? And why are both important?
Well, I think it's important because Sarah Sanders is helping all of us by speaking in behalf of the President of the United States and cutting through some of the fog, if you will. There's another word I want to use, but not on this station, I guess. So we want to cut through that and find out what is the truth. And my constituents, that was my number one job. Look, I got up at 4:30 in the morning when I was a congressman, read the bills before I went to the office, and I gave my staff some instructions and tried to do my best. Now, it's pretty difficult to do that because it's a 24/7 job. And I think it's important that we go and listen to Sarah Sanders. You're going to get 20 minutes of her speaking. And the rest of her time, she's going to be answering questions from the audience. And I'm looking forward to that because I know how she answers questions.
Well, she's got to have some amazing stories.
Yes, sir. Yes, she does. And I'm really looking forward to
So
hearing
how can
it.
people get tickets if they want to go? Are they still available?
Yes, sir.
And what do they do?
They go online to aneveningwithsarah.com. There's several, so you got to find the one that's at the Laurel Manor in Livonia. So it's aneveningwithsarah.com, and you can go and find out more information and buy your tickets there.
This Friday night.
This Friday night, 28th.
Thanks for
Kevin.
being here. We appreciate it.
God bless you, sir.
All right. We'll be
Thank
right
you.
back with more news now after this. What a week in national politics. I cannot remember a time in my life that people paid so much attention to the Nevada presidential primary. But this year included a first appearance in a debate by billionaire Michael Bloomberg, and then a vote over the weekend that shows Bernie Sanders is clearly the Democratic frontrunner. Joining us now is political expert Doster Noah.
Thanks for having me.
So again, another wild week. I mean, we haven't talked since Bloomberg debated.
Right.
Did you see that?
I did.
That was kind of a debacle in my eyes. He didn't have a lot of time to prepare.
No, he didn't, and everyone was gunning for him. I'd say he should have been better prepped. I mean, he has to know coming on the stage that everyone's going to come after him, and Elizabeth Warren certainly did that.
Yeah, and to not have answers ready for those questions seemed odd. Almost even if he wasn't great at answering them, you would think he would have these talking points that no matter how often they came at him, he would just keep saying the same thing over and over again. But that didn't really happen. He sort of was forced to think on his feet, and his answers didn't seem great.
No, I mean, it was a big hit to his campaign because this was the first time anyone saw him matched up against the other candidates. He looks great in a commercial, but then standing on stage with 8 other people, it kind of showed his lack of experience and honestly his lack of preparation, which is not good.
It had some people saying, but don't count him out because there's been other candidates who failed miserably in their first debate and then came back to do well. Is that something he could still do?
For sure, and given the amount of money that he has, he can certainly change that first impression. And I think you'll see, I mean, we're heading into South Carolina coming up soon, and then Super Tuesday, and I think you will start to see him actually do well and start to gain delegates on Super Tuesday. So that first impression was not a very good one, but he has time to make up for it and money to make up for it.
Probably good for him that nobody was voting for him. I mean, there was no ability to vote for him in that primary because he may not have performed very well. But someone who did perform well was Bernie Sanders.
Oh, certainly. And I mean, he is by far the front runner right now and for the Democratic nomination. And he's trying to do what Trump did, and that is come in second in Iowa, win New Hampshire, win Nevada, and now moving on to South Carolina. And that's what really got Trump the momentum in 2016. So the Sanders playbook looks a lot like the Trump playbook did back in 2016.
Now, everyone was talking about Biden doing well in South Carolina, and I don't really remember a bunch of people talking too much about who was going to do what in Nevada, but I think they thought Biden was going to do better.
Probably numbers-wise. I mean, I think as it came closer to Nevada, Bernie was going to be number 1, Biden was going to be number 2. I think people thought it would be a lot closer. And now as they head into South Carolina, it's the reverse. People expect Biden to win and Bernie to come in second, but what they're going to really look at is that margin. Biden should be doing really well in South Carolina and win by a huge margin. And if he doesn't, that's going to be a real negative for him.
And what about the other candidates? They didn't perform real well in Nevada. Do they have enough money to make it to Super Tuesday? Are they all in for sure until Super Tuesday?
Absolutely. And they're going to pick up some delegates. You'll see someone like an Elizabeth Warren win in Colorado and pick up delegates there. Pete Buttigieg will pick up maybe some delegates along the way. So right now there's really no incentive to get out until after Super Tuesday, and then see where you go from there. But the money is going to start to dry out, and we're going to get down to about 3 or 4 candidates after Super Tuesday.
So Michigan's right after Super Tuesday. So after Super Tuesday, the numbers come in. How many people do you think drop out? How many people stay in?
I think you're going to see 3 candidates drop out and make that calculation that they can't move on. I think here in Michigan, you're going to look at Biden, Bloomberg, and Bernie as being the 3 front runners, really competing for votes. And those are going to be the candidates we watch as they head into Michigan.
Okay, and so what has to happen in this next debate? People are going to be watching to see if Bloomberg can get back on his feet.
That's number one. Number two is, and again, this is following the Trump playbook. You know, Elizabeth Warren has not gone after Bernie Sanders because she is afraid of alienating his supporters. That's no different than Ted Cruz not going after Trump, making a calculation that Trump at some point was going to fade out, and then Cruz could step in and win those voters. I think Elizabeth Warren's making the same calculation. We'll see Pete Buttigieg and Biden go after Bernie, knowing full well they have to take him down.
So they may not be as focused and targeted on Bloomberg this time around.
No, I think the damage to Bloomberg was done, and now they have to bring Bernie back down and basically supplant him and have a much stronger showing on Super Tuesday than anyone thinks they might have at this point in time.
It could be interesting then, because if they don't go after him, Bloomberg would have less time on air, and if Bloomberg isn't necessarily fighting for it, he may not get a lot of time on air.
That's true, and almost by association, he becomes an irrelevancy because all of a sudden no one's focusing on him anymore and focusing on Bernie.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about this idea of Bernie Sanders. Is it possible that people don't care as much about where he stands on the issues and just care about whether or not they like him or not, or if they think he'll look out for them given the opportunity? Because I kind of hear that when people talk about Trump, and now I'm starting to hear that about Bernie. It's not the issues, it's do we like him?
Yeah, and again, this is so much like Trump because the political establishment is up in arms and they're screaming and they're going crazy and we can't do this, he's not electable. We heard that about Trump against Clinton. Same thing about Bernie, but the rank and file love him. And they have no problem with him and take no issues with him. And they think he will fight for them and he will disrupt the political system, which is what they want to see. They don't think the political system's working for him, and they think Bernie can help bring it back to more people-centric.
Yeah, we see the media and the political insiders, and they're all like, no, this is never going to work. This is never going to work. But then all of a sudden, some candidate sort of just catches the imagination of the people, and they're suddenly popular, and people want to vote. It's like a popularity contest sometimes.
And that's exactly what it is. Last time it was like, who do you dislike least? Okay, I'm going to vote for that person. That's where we're headed in 2020. Who do you dislike least between Bernie Sanders and his socialism and Trump and his populism? And that's essentially what I think most people think is going to happen in November.
I only have about 20 seconds, but let's talk about Trump for a second in India. What impact will that have?
I mean, he's playing the presidential card, the incumbent card. It makes him look very presidential, and he's talking about trade, which is always good when he focuses on the economy.
So he's doing what he should be doing.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. For everybody at News Now, I'm Kevin Dietz.